Good morning, everyone. Welcome to another year of cardiovascular medicine grand rounds. We are, happy to start and get with today's session. And I'm not going to spend time introducing Harlan because people probably know him better than they know me. So I'll defer the stage to Harlan, and we'll kind of go from there. Thank you.
That might be the best introduction I've ever had. Thank you, Rohan. So it's a pleasure to be here on the kickoff of the Grand Round schedule, and I appreciate the invitation from Oyeri and Rohan and from the entire group. I find in the time of COVID that these Grand Rounds are extraordinarily unusual in the sense that what I do is I end up talking to a camera, actually a light on my computer for an hour, and everyone is pretty much off camera, which by the way, I do too. So I'm not saying people are welcome to stay off camera, but it's an unusual experience. So I told Rohan, I think one of the problems is that what we do is we just transport the usual format into a Zoom format. And I think maybe that's not the best way to do this. I mean, we need to adapt to the technology and understand the way in which we can optimize the experience. So what I said I thought might be worth trying is that I just chunk the talk. And then if there are any questions, answer one or two questions as the talk goes through to make it a little more interactive. So what I urge you to do is to, in the chat comment section, if you have any questions, and I hope I will stimulate some questions from you in the course of even the beginning of the talk. You'll see I'm going to chunk it for a second. And then Rohan can convey those questions and when there's a quick pause. So again, my thought is we need to kind of reinvent the way that we do things. And if we're going to be doing grand rounds like this, I think it may be worth thinking about whether or not the old format where someone stood in front of you in a live presentation and spoke for about 40 minutes, 50 minutes, and then took questions at the end is really the best way to do this if we're going to do it on Zoom, because I really think there may be better ways for us to think about this. And I think that this gets to the spirit of this talk, which is not having merely to accept the way that things are, but thinking about whether there are ways that we can optimize what we do. So let me launch into this. Hey, Rohan, you see my screen?
Yes, we can see.
Okay, great. So, I sort of playfully put this down. I put the word and then I said, what is it? Why should I care? Anyone who's listening to this, this is an unusual Grand Rounds in the sense that I'm talking about really meta science. I'm talking about the science of our science and the way in which we communicate science rather than taking it around a content of a particular issue in cardiology. And then how do I pronounce it? So let me get to the first thing. So I found out that a lot of people aren't sure how to pronounce this, and it looks sort of like therapy with the RX in the middle, but it's pronounced MedArchive. And I'll get a little bit more into what that is and how we should, how it ended up with that name. So here are my disclosures. I have no relevant financial disclosures for this talk. I'm a co-founder of MedArchive, which is co-located within a nonprofit. And I'm a volunteer for MedArchive. I'm a member of the MedArchive oversight team. My institution, Yale, receives no revenue from MedArchive. And MedArchive currently is supported in part by the Chan Zuckerberg Initiative and sits within the Cold Spring Harbor Laboratories, like I said, which is a nonprofit. One of my goals at the end is to orient you to this idea of what are preprints. And if you're an academic who's producing scholarship, to encourage you to post preprints, cite preprints. For any of you can be part of actually the affiliates that very lightly, and reviews not quite even the right word, screen preprints. And many of you are already reading preprints. But let's just get down to this. Like what is a preprint? And so a preprint is a research manuscript that is yet to be certified by peer review. One of the nuances of giving it in your home. So my phone just went off. So let me get back. So preprint is a research manuscript yet to be certified by peer review and accepted for publication at a journal. And a preprint server is an online platform dedicated to the distribution of preprints. So again, getting to this, it's a research manuscript, but it hasn't yet been peer reviewed. By the way, we talk about research all the time in peer review settings. I mean, when you go to the American College of Cardiology or the American Heart Association, you know that there's no real peer review of abstracts. I mean, someone looks for 10 seconds at a paragraph and gives it a grade, but that's not really any sort of peer review. Posters. And then, by the way, what usually happens is that the American Heart Association, American College of Cardiology actually actively promotes this pre-peer review science. They have press conferences. There's often a lot of rigmarole about it, even in the absence of having a peer review publication. We have our own research in progress sessions. Sometimes people are giving grand rounds. This is a pre-peer review format where I could be presenting research, and with social media, anyone could take something that I'm presenting in this format and tweet it and send it out to the world. In fact, I hope you do that with this talk. So a preprint just I'm having trouble here. So in a regular setting for peer review, a scientist submits a manuscript to a journal, an editor sends it out to reviewers. It may, by the way, this can be a cycle where it goes back and forth and all around, from the editor back to the scientist. It could be rejected, goes to go to another journal, months and years pass, finally it can be published. Preprints are scientist has a manuscript, has finished the study, sends it into the preprint server, and within days it's posted for people to see and discuss. They can simultaneously, if they want, submit it to a journal. Many preprint servers have the ability to actually post it on the preprint server and automatically have it sent to a journal. But the central difference here is that you are immediately sharing your work in a format in which it can be cited, referenced, seen. It's going to be archived. It's not going to go away. It has what they call a DOI. There's an identifier associated with it. It is not a publication, but it's essentially you passing around your research manuscript to people who can take a look at it. So it turns out in this world, there are a lot of preprint servers, and almost for every discipline, there are preprint servers. I discovered this several years ago. And as I began doing more work in data science, as many of you know, a lot of my work has gone very much towards translational informatics, the use of large data sets, the employment of advanced analytics, in an effort to try to understand whether, as we've gone through this digital transformation in medicine, we can leverage it to make us better doctors, to deliver better care, to get better outcomes, to be more accountable for care in real time. And if I depended in that world, in data science world and in the informatics world, on publications, I'd be years behind everyone else, because what people are looking at is what's coming out on the preprint servers. And that can be an archive or in a wide variety of sources. But if I want to know what's going on in the field, I can't be paying attention to that. And there's a big analogy here to economics. Many of you may have been a little more familiar with what happens in economics, which is the publication of record for an economist usually will come out years later in one of their esteemed journals that will represent the finished product that will have gone through peer review. But if any of you have noticed MBER or SSRN or a wide variety of other preprint servers, I mean, when economists finish their work, and by the way, we're never finished with our work as scientists. So when they finished and at a certain juncture, they will post it on a preprint server for large scale discussion. And most of what you see when people are talking about economics papers they're discussing preprints. And it's and for people going on job talks, for people applying for grants, they're usually referencing preprints in economics. And like I said, this goes for every field. Psychology, you can see this is just a taste of the number of preprint servers that are out there in the life sciences. bioRxiv for our colleagues who spend most of their life in the life sciences. This is second nature to post things on bioRxiv now, which is, I think, maybe 7 or 8 years old, but is now mainstream usual way that people do work. So let me just ask a question there. I've introduced the idea of preprints. I've talked about what the definition is, how they work, and the number of preprint servers that are out there. I don't know. I just want to pause for a second if anyone has any questions about what a preprint or preprint server is, or maybe you all are familiar with it.
Yuri has a question, Harlan.
Okay. I think maybe better you just read the question because then we can just go ahead. Or if you have if it's not written down, go ahead.
Wait, do you want to read or do you want me to read? Sorry.
In the future, you read Rohan just for efficiency, but go ahead.
Sure, I'll read. So, Harlan, first of all, thanks for teaching us how to pronounce that, because I was one of the people who didn't know it was MedArchive. My question is, and this might be a very naive one, but is there a conflict here for the journals that print papers? So if I have access to the preprint, will I want to read it in the journal?
So it's a very really good question. I'm going to get a little more later to the journal's attitude towards preprints, but if the journals are worth anything, then what goes through peer review should be a bit different than what it was when you submitted it. The journals will suggest that it will be much better. I remember how Bachner at JAMA was always telling me how many times they reversed the findings with the authors. To me, the preprint is the director's cut. It's what I want to say. I don't know how many times you've had this experience, but the journal editors sometimes think they're authors and they really actually want to control exactly what you can say. I mean, it's your discussion. You're telling people how you interpret your findings and they're telling you, that they want to do it. They want you to say something different. Now, I understand it if there are wild claims within the discussion, but oftentimes, and I think we've all had this experience, they're essentially rewriting the discussion in their voice, saying what they think it means. And I'm saying write an editorial, but to me, the preprint's the director's cut. I finished this at this juncture. And by the way, I can version it on a preprint server. If you give me comments, I can then post the next version and the next version, because I believe it's iterative. The preprint is research in progress. And by the way, I still think that the peer review publication represents a juncture in research rather than an end. But that's, I think, a good research project too, because this really anchors what did it look like before it went to the journals. And for the first time, we'll be able to see what happened in the course of the peer review process, bring transparency to that. So to go on a little bit, so some of you may know that.
There are two more questions if you have a second. Two questions are, could you refer the preprint to your own manuscript? And Al has a question, do some journals not allow preprint publications prior to submission or review?
Yeah, good questions. I'm going to get to that issue about the preprints and accepting it, but I'll say what we published a paper more than a year ago that's in which we did a survey, and 86% of the high impact journals, of 100 of the top high impact journals in medicine accepted preprints. I think it's even higher now. What was the other question?
Could you refer the preprint to your own manuscript? That's what.
Could you
reference the preprint?
Yeah, and I'm going to show you how that happens on the preprint server. I can't control what the journals do, and I would think most journals would allow you to do that. I'll give you one quick scenario about what we did with a recent preprint. We submitted a viewpoint to JAMA Health Policy, and in that viewpoint, we provided some numbers that we had run based on we had done an analysis of the CDC database. And they said to us, well, turn this into a research letter because it looks like we need to see the justification for those numbers. And I said, well, what if I preprint it and then reference the preprint in the viewpoint? And they said, yeah, that's fine. And then we still might publish actually that preprint in a different format, but it provided us with the means to be able to show our transparency with the numbers and how we calculated them, and then be able to reference that. So some of you may know that I have been quite interested in the ecosystem of medical research. So I've got my own areas thematically of research within cardiology and sometimes beyond cardiology. But I'm also interested in how we do research and what we can do better and how we can optimize our current situation. And I was editor of Circulation Quality and Outcomes for almost a decade. And at the end of my time there, I wrote this piece, which if any of you are interested, I refer you to it, called The End of Journals. But I said for hundreds of years, medical journals have served as arbiters of quality of medical research, but the traditional peer review publication models frame the hierarchical gateway to publication, historically in the hands of experts, is at odds with the ubiquitous democratization of data and information in the 21st century. And in this piece, I kind of go through what I think are some of the problems that hamper peer review. And I say things like too slow, too expensive, too limited, too powerful, not transparent enough, and so forth, and behind a firewall, and too inaccessible to most people. And so, but one of the things personally as an investigator that was bothersome to me was how often I was waiting. And so I would be proud of a publication, let me say a manuscript, a study that we had completed and was eager for feedback and would submit it to a journal and then just hurry up and wait, you know, and sometimes the wait was excruciating. And, you know, there are a million examples of it. And those of you who submit a lot of manuscripts know this drill. I mean, even more recently, we submitted to a reasonably high profile journal, and it took we submitted in May, and we queried them in July, and they said, oh, they had a snafu, they're having trouble finding an editor. They didn't send it out for review until a few weeks ago. I had a piece at one of the top journals in health services research, HSR, and we submitted, they took them 6 months to give us a decision. They wanted to revise and resubmit. It was a lot that they asked of us. We took another 3 months to have to run all those analyses. That was on us. We submitted to them. Over a year later, they had not rendered a decision. And we were like pelting them every month. What's going on? Oh, we're trying to decide. We can't decide. I went to the editor. I couldn't get a decision out of it. And I think it was really just the dysfunction within the editorial team that they couldn't render a decision on this manuscript. Finally, we pulled it, sent it to another place, and within 6 weeks, we had an acceptance because we sent it in with the reviews, and the thing got published in JAMA Network Open. But you know, this idea of waiting, I mean, we have a sense that our research is timely, that it's important, that it ought to be communicated to other investigators, that we want to collaborate, we want to build, we want to move. And this became quite a choke point, at least for our own work, that was quite frustrating. And so if nothing else, that was a big bother. And then we also were publishing a series of papers around publication bias in medicine and delays that were occurring even in very important journals. So in this case, this is a paper we wrote, Publication Reporting of Clinical Trials Results. So these are experiments on human beings that are being conducted at academic medical centers across the country. And then we said, well, how long does it take to publish those once they're noted to have been completed on clinicaltrials.gov? So experiments on human beings, they are conducted. They're actually, the investigators have said, and we finished the trial. They've registered that on clinicaltrials.gov, which, by the way, they weren't even mandated to do, but they went ahead and did that. And this is what the time to publication curve looks like. So you'll notice two things on this curve. One is, by the way, Rohan, can you see my pointer on this when I do this?
No. Yeah, I see.
You can? So there's two things on this. One is that you'll notice how slow this is. So look, at 20 months after completion, you've got just about 30% of them that are published. Now, we often think about these late-breaking clinical trials, simultaneous publications. You know, we have in our mind this representative heuristic. If someone asks us, that makes us think that clinical trials get published right away and that there's no delay, but that's not true for the vast majority of them. And so at almost 2 years, you're almost at 30%, but look what happens. Then it tops out. About 40% of the trials never get published. They never get reported in clinicaltrials.gov. They never get published in the overall literature. And so 40% of these experiments. So we repeated this study, by the way, in NIH trials and found exactly the same thing. This wasn't just about like small, crappy trials that people were running on their own with no funding. If you looked at NIH trials, you saw almost exactly the same curve. NIH, by the way, when we published that, didn't believe us. We published it in BMJ. They criticized us publicly, and then they repeated it. And Mike Lauer then was first author on a NEJM paper that found exactly the same curve. It validated almost identically what we found. So this is about publication bias. lots of trials finished and they aren't done. We talked to some investigators. They said, well, I don't know. They didn't get to it. It was too hard to I don't know what. There were a million different excuses and the delays in the publication. And this also was bothering me, that there wasn't an easy way for people to just share the results. As you know, our group has been working hard on a wide variety of areas around research, how to improve the scientific ecosystem, improve the speed, integrity, reproducibility through open science, open access, open communication. And it seemed natural to kind of start thinking about what else we could do. Around the time that I'm sort of pondering all this, maybe a decade ago, I'm starting to get inspired. I was asked to be on a group called ASCP Bio. Again, our colleagues in life sciences might know about this. This was a group that Ron Vale put together, Jessica Polka, who's in this picture down the lower left. Harold Varmus was a big proponent and also part of this board. We have about 5 of us, Hyman, and who were trying to figure out how could we promote the idea of preprints. Actually, I'd been invited down to Howard Hughes to give a talk about open science. And I kind of ended up talking to these folks and they invited me to become part of this ASCP Bio idea. And I also was able to hear Paul Ginsberg, who's up at the top, who was a physicist who started arXiv, the first real preprint server that went and used a technology platform. And what Paul did in the beginning was, so he was at Cornell, and they had this sort of habit of what they would do is they'd be working on a paper and they would post it on their door of their office, and they would ask their colleagues to come by and take a look and write comments on it. And then this is maybe in the 1990s, and all of a sudden they start thinking about, well, maybe we can automate this process, maybe we can open it up further. And anyway, it starts to evolve in a way to go to a computer platform where people can access it, they can read each other's papers, and they can provide comments on it. Well, sort of fast forward, becomes arXiv. Cornell actually owns arXiv, and arXiv has become a place for a lot of physical sciences and mathematical sciences, data science. A lot of data science stuff ends up on arXiv. But I starts percolating with me about this. And then there's this guy, Brian Nosik, who's a psychologist who's done just remarkable work in the reproducibility of science. And at another session, we can talk about that and the issues around reproducibility in science and what's trustworthy and what's not. But he starts his Center for Open Science, and he begins kind of an incubator for preprint servers. And he comes to Yale and gives a talk. It was on main campus. I attended, and I'm like enamored by Brian. Like, I'm thinking, like, this guy is amazing. I mean, he's really trying to change the world and trying to open up science. He's focusing a lot on the flaws and the ways in which science is conducted and communicated. And he's really pushing like this sort of turnkey solution with preprints. And I still think I have such deep and great admiration for Brian. So, ASCP Bio, we start producing some content around saying, like, why should you care about preprints? Well, it could be about priority claim. That is, sometimes you find something, you're the first person to find it, but now if it's not going to be acknowledged until it winds its way through the peer review process, whether you're first or not is going to depend on whether you pick the right journal. Did you pick an easy one or a hard one? Did you pick a fast one or a slow one? And with preprints, you can put it up, show people, this is what I thought, this is what I found. It's there for people to see. There's a claim, you can receive feedback. It has been shown, and some people have suggested it can increase attention and citations. And it can also be proof of productivity. A lot of times the CV is only showing you what's been peer reviewed, but especially for those going out for jobs or applying for grants, it can show up until yesterday what studies you've completed. And you're not constrained by what may still be going through a peer review. And if anyone wants to look at it, there can be a link to it. So let me just stop here and say, so I've sort of just gone through a little bit of this rationale for what was in my mind, the concerns I have, what problem was I trying to solve, the thing about weighting, the thing about communication, the thing about publication bias, the thing about transparency, and the inspiration I received from those who had been forging ahead in different fields.
We have 2 questions.
Okay.
And Dr. Lampert has a question too. I might just go with the first and then ask Dr. Lampert and then go to the second.
Okay, go.
Harlan has a question. Having preprints would deter journals to accept an article for review? I think it follows a little bit from in lines of what Al said before.
Yeah, I think look, here's my question. Do we let journals dictate to us? Do we kowtow to journals and then, basically they set the rules, or do we set the rules? I mean, journals, it's a weird thing. We develop the content, we submit it, we often pay publication fees, and they become, big money makers. Elsevier is a multi-billion-dollar corporation. Most of these journals are, they can cry poverty, but they're the money makers for the organizations that they run. I think it's up to us. Like I said, 86% a year and a half ago of the journals said, Daisy Massey did this study, she works with me, said that they would accept preprints. I think we all have concerns, but what is it at the root of it? The journal wants to be the one to break the news. They want the attention, and is that really in the best interests of science and science communication? And so, in my experience so far, I haven't seen a situation where it is. New England Journal, Eric Rubin, who came from Life Sciences, and before he was editor of the New England Journal of Medicine and knew this world, one of the first things he did was to say, hey, if you've got something important, post it to a preprint. If it's time sensitive, post it to a preprint. In the COVID, they said, do not wait, don't worry, we're going to take it. JAMA was always dragging their feet a little bit. I think with Howard's no longer editor, there'll be a new editor of JAMA. We'll see what is, but I will say even with that, Howard Bachner was still a supporter, I think, up until the end. I mean, he just was raising tough questions. And, but I was just saying, JAMA was, JAMA Network Open from the very beginning was pushing them. Some of the other JAMAs weren't. I think, Al, in the end, it's going to be competitive disadvantage not to take, not to bias against if preprints have come up. And then it's up to the journals to say, can you bring it through the process so it's worth reading as a peer review publication beside the preprint? Next question, Rachel.
Hi, Harlan. I have a question for you. I completely agree with the frustrations you're describing around gatekeeping, around time, around all this type of thing. But there's a concept that you brought up that I would like to challenge a little bit, which is democratization of information. I think that democratization of information is currently contributing to the 1,500 deaths per day from COVID. And while the open science that you are pushing is different than people just making stuff up out of their heads, I do think there's a role for gatekeeping. And how do you see, do you think there's any role for gatekeeping, and how do you see incorporating that into our societal view of science?
Yeah, I think sort of horses out of the barn on the gatekeeping. I mean, unless you want to ban 80% of the journals that will publish almost anything that you submit and call it peer review. I mean, there are very few journals that really can invest the amount of resources to provide deep peer review, and even those led through the surgispheres, they don't have, I can tell you in my field, often the reviewers, it's hard to find reviewers that have the kind of expertise that's necessary. And we know this with Circ Outcomes, they're working hard to kind of figure out how, it's not just statisticians, but data scientists, to be able to get people, all the journals are asking you to volunteer your time for their enterprise. And most people aren't spending the amount of time with the article that would be necessary, which would be hours to really get to it. The source of the data is often obscure within a lot of the articles. So, I mean, I don't see peer review as that much of a bar. I mean, you can publish almost anything. There's a place you can find for almost anything. And by the way, people are disseminating information, and I'll get to the next section, in a variety of different ways, press release, Twitter. I mean, the thing about the preprint is, it's an artifact. It exists. You can point to it. Somebody can be making a wild claim, but you can go back to what is it that they're talking about and where did it come from? And I think we're in an age where it's not preprints that are causing that. Somebody yesterday tweeted, if it wasn't for preprints, we wouldn't have this ivermectin problem. I'm like, what are you talking about? Like, the ivermectin thing wasn't really from preprints. Just like, would you not have had the inject bleach problem without preprints? So I don't even see a preprint that was about injecting bleach, and the hydroxychloroquine thing was all this stuff that's circulating. I mean, the question is, can we be transparent about where is it coming from? What claims are people making? And in the end, we may disagree about this, but I just believe that having a place where you can anchor the preprint and now know what people are talking about and have that kind of transparency ends up being an advantage. So let me keep going and see if I can convince you, but it's certainly fair to have questions about this.
Point out that Samit's question is on the same lines about gatekeeper against bad science. And It points
Yep.
about an example of
And
COVID
we're going to we'll get to that. That's part of, actually, I end the talk around that. So let me just bring this up. So you guys all know about the Sprint research question. This is just an example of an application, but Sprint trials is being conducted. And then on September 11th, 2015, the Sprint team decides to have a press conference. So they have a press conference, NIH, they have a press conference. They announced Sprint trials positive. It produced a remarkable benefit. And, it was like a short press conference. There was nothing besides the press conference. This gets reported in the literature. This study provides potential life-saving information. And Gina Colada on September 11th, just to remind you, so that this September 11th press conference, September 11th, Gina reports it. And by the way, no clinician in the country can refer to anything on this except for actually the New York Times article and the NIH press release, which is light on details. And so this is the way that things get communicated. Often for many companies in industry, they have SEC requirements about reporting this stuff out. The Sprint trial comes out finally. So that, just to remind you again, September 11th, and the Sprint trial gets published sometime later. Let's see. I think I made a mistake on these dates, but it becomes in November 9th. So it comes out in November. Finally, the study comes out. And by the way, on clinicaltrials.gov, results first posted in December after the New England Journal comes out. So there was been no place to go to get the actual results except for the press conference. I got together with Topol and we wrote this piece in the New York Times. So the problem is that many details of the study haven't been released months before the study is presented at a major scientific meeting and possibly longer before it's published. So again, we're talking about this in September. It's 2 months later before it's presented at the AHA and simultaneously published in the New England Journal of Medicine. Meanwhile, nobody has anything to refer to in terms of what the study showed. We said, kudos to the scientists who conducted such a large, complex, important study, which will be likely to have life-saving consequences for condition can now be treated easily in most patients. Now the medical community needs to adopt a new approach to situations like this to disseminate life-saving results in a timely, comprehensive, and transparent way. Lives depend on it. The point was that didn't people deserve more than a press conference? If the NIH felt this was definitive enough to go public and have a press conference, wouldn't it have been definitive enough at least to share the pre-printed manuscript and show what results they're talking about? Because otherwise it's hearsay now for 2 months and there's really nothing to refer to. At that time, I'm sort of looking, there is this thing in the Life Sciences bioRxiv. I'm talking with John Inglis and Richard Seaver about, well, maybe bioRxiv can start expanding from life sciences to start publishing some things within clinical research. And they're kind of receptive to that. And they start thinking about doing it. I'll give you another scenario. So in 2017, you may have remembered that there was big news about the definition of hypertension has changed. And asking, are you ready? This is from an AHA promo. And in November 13th, AHA comes out with new high blood pressure guidelines. And you know the drill here, that they moved down the numbers, and based on Sprint, which again was in 2015, and by 2017, they're sort of following Sprint and saying we should be more aggressive about blood pressure. And I happened to meet this guy in the course of my travels, who is a remarkable scientist who is now at Yale, who starts. I'm interacting with him. We kind of are aware that the guidelines are going to come out. And there's already a buzz that they're going to lower the thresholds. And he asked this question, how's this going to affect the number of people labeled with hypertension? And we start talking about this. We said, well, this is kind of an important insight, which is what's the impact of this on those numbers? And we start thinking that, maybe we should start working on a study like this. And wouldn't it be good to share this quickly around the time that the guidelines are released? And so it ends up producing a paper, the impact of the 2017 ACC-AHA guidelines on the prevalence of hypertension in US and China. And the interesting thing about this, and this is the preprint that comes out. So, and Rohan was smart enough, I was talking about Rohan Kara, of course, it said it on the slide. Rohan was smart enough to actually format it. So it's nice, easy for people to read. and see the dramatic increase in the number of people who are going to be labeled with hypertension, and actually see some quantitative estimates of that. And one thing I want to note is that this was posted on November 13th. The guideline comes out on November 7th or something, and within days, this thing is available for people to see. And also, there's the November 13th, and it gets picked up by 45 news outlets, blogged by 2, tweeted by 149, gets a fair amount of attention. The altmetric is 459, and for those of you familiar with altmetric scores, you know that it got pretty good attention around what the implications were. And again, people were, but we got very little criticism on the methods. Actually, most people, I think, pretty much endorsed the methods. And we were able to get this. This actually got cited 15 times. But then also, look, it ultimately gets published in BMJ, not bad. And on the bioRxiv site, you can see now published. If you want to see the preprint, you would know it was now published in BMJ. And you can link to the BMJ article, which now shows here, which came up, was accepted in April of 2018 and was published, I think, a month or so later. Actually, let's see, first published on July. So it's published July 2018, almost a year later from the time that we did it. If you're just curious, the conclusion, look at bioRxiv versus medRxiv, adopting the guidelines will be associated with substantial increase in the prevalence of hypertension, both US and China. If you look at what came out in BMJ, if adopted, the ACCHA hypertension will markedly increase the number of people labeled as hypertension. Actually, the central finding was the same, but the BMJ article also got a lot of attention and has been cited quite frequently as really the publication of record that talks about what the implications were of the 2017 guidelines. Around this time, I'm thinking like, well, bioRxiv is not necessarily the best fit. It's not optimized for preprinting. And I'm invited to give a talk at the 8th International Congress on Peer Review and Scientific Publication. Actually, I'm invited to give a keynote, and they don't give me a topic. They say, do whatever you want. And this is the meeting for medical publishers. So almost every major publisher will, every major journal in medicine will send representatives to this. The room's, got about 1,000 people. They're presenting information about the medical publishing industry and trying to talk about the science of their industry. And you can see they're saying enhancing quality and credibility of science. So I give a talk and I decide I'm going to say we're going out for this. We're going to start medArchive. And you can see at that time I spelled it that way with an A in it, MedArchive. But I just decided that we should try to do this in our field, and we should optimize it for clinical medicine. And actually, I think people were pretty surprised. And I will tell you the truth, I didn't know how we were going to do it. I announced we were going to launch it, and I didn't know exactly how we were going to launch it. I've been working with my team, the Yale Open Data Access team, my close colleague Joe Ross, and the team at Core, and we sort of had decided we were going to work with Brian Nosek and try to figure out how to do it. And at that meeting, I met with the folks from bioRxiv and people from BMJ, and we decided to work together with them and build on top of bioRxiv to create medArchive. I think I'm just going to, because I now see that I want to try to get through the rest of this in about 12 or 15 minutes, but I'm going to skip through that next set of questions. So then we end up launching medArchive a year later. And the reason was because in part at that meeting in Chicago, a lot of the publishers raised really hard questions, kind of questions that Rachel's raising too, which is about misinformation. Do we really need this? Isn't peer review necessary in medicine? Don't we need to have all this sort of screening? And I think the juxtaposition was between that and thinking about scientific communication as a progressive and self-correcting thing, our ability to work with our colleagues, the ability to have sort of open access. So we launched medArchive as a community-based nonprofit, free for everyone, with author-centric services, not products or publications, but just a means for authors to be able to archive their work and to share it, and to keep a publisher independent. Papers are screened by experts, and I'll talk about that in a second, but for rapid posting within 24, 48 hours. And you can continue to revise and post the next version as much as you want, version 1, 2, 3, 4, as you get feedback and improve it. There are transfer pipelines to and from other journals, content APIs with feeds and social media accounts, and text mining and resources. And And we had to think about how were we going to mitigate the harm, because we wanted to be able to create some guardrails. So we developed a large number of submission requirements, which meant that you had to have IRB approval, you had or waiver, you had to identify yourself, you had to follow ICGME disclosure requirements. You couldn't identify individuals, so there are clear posting criteria. We're only going to do research articles, not opinion pieces. And we needed to signal the need for caution when scientists and non-scientists read and review preprints, that these are pre-peer review. And we said things on the site, like preprints are preliminary reports of work that have not been peer reviewed. They should not be relied on to guide clinical practice or health-related behaviors. Should not be reported in news media as established information. The article's a preprint and has not been peer reviewed. What does that mean? It reports new medical research that's yet to be evaluated, and so should not be used directly to guide clinical practice. Of course, for those of you who are able to peer review it, you can make your own decisions. But we're trying to be careful here around a large number of people who would be unable to provide good peer review of a preprint. We also urge journalists and other individuals who report on medical research to the general public to consider, when discussing work that appears on MedArchive, consider this when discussing work that appears on MedArchive and emphasizes yet to be evaluated by the medical community, and information may be erroneous. By the way, so may it be in peer review, but we want to say that you have to know that it has not been through peer review. And I won't go through this in detail, but just to say, like I said, that we adopted a lot of the standards in order to try to add additional guardrails and optimize the use for a clinical service. I'm going to push through here a second, just because I want to cover some of this content. So just to say that we started growing here early. We launched in June of 2019, and our growth was slow and gradual in terms of submissions. We didn't have any budget for PR, so this was all word of mouth largely. And by the way, we were growing faster in these initial months than MedArchive did at a similar point in time after their launch, and they've become very successful. So even though it looks pretty flat here in the beginning, it actually was, we were quite happy about it. And then the pandemic took over. And then we started becoming sort of the place where lots of people were posting information from around the world that they were learning from the pandemic, so people could exchange information, and it went bonkers. And you can see this cumulative new paper starts really climbing. And this CV here, I know we're used to CV cardiovascular, this is COVID, but you can see that the MedArchive COVID papers, the light green, especially as you got into the fall and winter of 2019 and 2020, we start getting a lot of COVID papers, and the non-COVID papers increased some, but we're kind of holding steady on a month to month. And if you look by category, the vast majority of MedArchive posts, particularly through the pandemic, have been infectious disease and epidemiology, but we're seeing growth in a wide variety of other areas. And I would say pandemic's important, but is cardiovascular disease any less important? Speed's important in the pandemic, but is progress and speed any less important in cardiovascular care? Should we be avidly sharing our research and being able to elicit comments from our community so we can forge collaborations and push forward ever faster? That's the case for this. If you look at withdrawn manuscripts, 0.2% are withdrawn. We don't call them retracted because they were never published, but 0.2 are withdrawn. These are ones that basically when fraud or other malfeasance is shown. And by the way, COVID, non-COVID, still about 0.2%. Not many in the end. So this was 22,039 overall have been withdrawn. MedArchive as of July, 6 million abstract views, 700,000 full text views, 1.7 million PDF downloads. I mean, this was like build it and they will come. Allow people to post their manuscripts for discussion, open outside of a firewall, and see what happens. And people start doing it. 12,100 institutions are represented among the MedArchive preprints, 145 countries. Top countries are USA, UK, India, and Germany. This is what, I'd said before, Daisy Massey works with our group and is applying to medical school now, did a study of the assessment of preprint policies in top-ranked clinical journals. And at that time, which was, like I said, more than a year ago, we found that 86% took them. I'm just going to go through just quickly the rest, because I think I'll leave all the questions to the end. So I mean, what are some of the interesting things that happen? You may have seen this paper. I consider it one of the, probably maybe the most important COVID paper so far around dexamethasone in hospitalized patients with COVID, associated with about a 17% reduction in mortality. This is from the Recovery Collaborative Group. The Martin Landry and Peter Horby have put together a marvelous thing in the UK. And so this ends up getting published in July 17th. But, you know, Martin and Peter posted it as a preprint as soon as they were ready to go. And they called it a preliminary report, but this ends up on MedArchive on June 22nd, 2020, and elicits a ton of comments online, both comments within MedArchive and on Twitter and a variety of other platforms, people asking questions, Peter and Martin engaging, a lot of discussion. So the scientific community sort of has a chance to externally vet this paper and discuss it in the course of its practice. And it ends up, you may say, well, so what was the difference? June 22nd and coming out later. By the way, just to compare head to head, the results in the end were exactly the same. The preprint on the left, the NEJM article on the right. NEJM makes them take the y-axis from 0 to 100. They did it 0 to 50 in the preprint. I don't know why the confidence interval went from 0.74 to 0.92 in the preprint, 0.75 to 0.93 in NEJM. To me, all de minimis changes. The risk ratio is still 0.83, and there was really no substantial difference. Of course, a very high quality group. And you know, so you may say, what's the difference between June 22nd and July 17th? Well, lots of people being hospitalized with COVID, lots of decisions about this. By the time New England Journal paper came out, the paper had been externally and publicly deeply vetted. And so then the paper comes out, it becomes a publication of record. And lots of practice guidelines changed almost immediately because there didn't need to be another 3 weeks or month for people to discuss the NEJM paper. It had already by experts been deeply vetted and relatively unchanged. Recovery Group has, I'm proud to say, posted almost all their stuff within MedArchive and similarly have received deep public vetting. And then they end up being most of them in New England Journal or Lancet and in top journals. And by the time they are, like I said, there's already been a deep discussion about them in the public domain. I'm going to end by just bringing up this point. So you may have seen this paper, and Rohan sent me this last night. I was already aware of it. I thought this was a good one just to show you. So you guys may know John Mandrola. He's an EP physician in Louisville who gained a lot of public attention from a blog that he wrote. And then he became for one of the cardiology platforms, sort of a central writer on a week-to-week basis. He's got a pretty big Twitter following. He's a clinician and writer and influencer, I would say. So he gets together with a couple of other people, some who have had prior agendas, and they write this piece, SARS-CoV-2 mRNA vaccination-associated myocarditis in children ages 20 to 17, a stratified national data analysis. And what they do is they take advantage of the vaccine adverse event reporting system that CDC has, which is in the public domain, and they analyze the data. And by the way, they go out, this is a hot topic. Look at this alt metric. I mean, these alt metrics are crazy. Like this alt metric, almost 10,000. For those of you who don't know, like you publish a paper and you get an alt metric of 20 to 30 to 40, like you're pretty happy. Like a lot, that means people are looking at your stuff. You know, when I showed you what Rohan got before on the preprint that he put out around the guidelines, I mean, that's just like an exceptional, outstanding top 1% of the attention. Lots of people are talking about it. That's what it means. Lots of people are talking about it. So this gets almost to 10,000. Lots of people are talking about this. You know, what does it mean? Because in the end, it's getting to the balance of risks and benefits for vaccination of youth and whether or not the risks are going to outweigh the benefits. And of course, this gets you embroiled in politics. Here's what they said in the preprint. Further research into the severity and long-term sequelae of post-vaccination cardiac adverse events is warranted. Quantification of the benefits of the second vaccination dose and vaccination in addition to natural immunity in this demographic may be indicated to minimize harm. Now that seems pretty benign. Rachel knows John. John, you know, has gotten into some controversy, but he's a good guy and is trying, I think, to to add information to the debates and to the discussion, the public discussion. Further research is warranted. Quantification may be indicated. And they're raising the question about whether the risks in youth of myocarditis outweighs the individual benefit, not the societal benefit, the individual benefit for these people. And by the way, lots of people are talking about this issue. And you know, they say post-vaccination rates were highest in young boys aged 12 to 15. And for those without medical morbidity, you know, they're just questioning whether this balance, what's going on with this balance. So then what happens is Marjorie Taylor Greene, which many of you may know by her initials MTG, and this is from Wikipedia, is an American politician, businesswoman, and far-right conspiracy theorist. And she's all in with QAnon, serving as U.S. representative for Georgia's 14th congressional district. Many of you may know her. So she takes this preprint, and I'm going to show you what and some of the news around it. And she tweets about it, you know, and says, you know, when boys and young men are at higher risk being hospitalized than taking COVID, there's every reason to stop COVID vaccine mandates, stop the insanity. And she cites something in The Guardian. And so, of course, this is going to, you know, flare, right? You know, immediately it falls into politics. The Telegraph had said, you know, tweeted this: teenage boys are 6 times more likely to suffer heart problems from the vaccine than those hospitalized with COVID, a major study found. Again, no nuance here, no acknowledgement that's a preprint. Most of what I've seen published, like in the New York Times or in any sort of high quality traditional media, have generally cited when preprints are pre-peer review. They should be understood in that context. Here, the Telegraph in the UK is going way outside of the bounds of what they should. They're violating the norms and suggesting that this is actually a peer-reviewed study and that people should depend on it. It's useful information, and the politicians are already picking up on it. So this inflames a lot of stuff on Twitter. You guys may know there's always that person, that guy who every time you tend to do something goes on Twitter and starts going against it. This is that guy. Bobbitt is a guy trained here at Yale, and I don't know why, but every time, whether it's readmissions or preprints or something, he sort of must have me on his speed dial, because he's like, every time I do something, he's on as some sort of a gadfly on Twitter. But he's like saying there's a breakdown because MedArchive graced both Guardian News with false headlines, breakdown in MedArchive. And then while myocarditis risk is debated, the harm benefit calculus was gamed. So he's criticizing the paper. The foreign policy, meaning MedArchive, was either insufficient or too porous. And another guy said, good thread on myocarditis preprint. I bet this person, who I don't know, I've been very critical of preprints. They too quickly disseminated in the media, and this one's no exception. On the other hand, I think the vitriol directed at these authors is wrong, and they give some thoughts. You know, what I said was to that person was, do you get that the discussion about the preprint is exactly the purpose of the preprint? So that when someone claims something, you can look at the source, and experts or anyone can comment, and it can generate a large public discussion, ideally respectfully, and ideally bringing in a wide range of viewpoints. I also tweeted that we're in an era where information is disseminated in so many ways: social media, SOMI is social media, press release, rumor, and more. And peer review, well, you can publish almost anything somewhere. At least on MedArchive, there's a document open to the world to discuss what it means. And so people can gather around and say, is this credible? Is it not credible? We know it's not peer reviewed yet. What does it mean, and how should it be done? I also went back to that idea that we had too porous of policies and said, I respectfully disagree. The intensity of the debate is exactly what we're trying to foster in science. That some outlets, media outlets, push the science as a problem with the media, not the problem that we're posting on preprints. Because the truth is that people, in the absence of preprints, what are people doing? They're posting it on Twitter, or they're on their own websites, and the things are ephemeral. They can disappear. At least a preprint is there historically, will be there no matter what. And you can always refer back to it and see what it is that this is that's engendering the kind of comments. Richard Seaver, my colleague at Cold Spring Harbor, who is my colleague in this, says, channeling me, misspelling there, but channeling me a bit. But the argument is the data, the argument that we make at MedArchive is the data are there to be debated and challenged. since the preprint has appeared, almost every analysis paper I've seen has picked up on its flaws. One would hope this will be addressed in peer review and in people's interpretation. And he says part of the evolution of scholarly communication requires acclimatizing people to this new norm. We are in a moment in history, I think, where a new norm is emerging. And I say this is an important point. We're still in the early phase of clinical preprints. Norms are evolving, and science is being communicated in new ways. We urge the community to comment, engage, inform, debate, educate each other and the public about these contributions. And so just back to the beginning, I mean, I hope that you will engage in this. And I don't mind that, you know, if you're going to critique, then let's figure out what makes it better. If you want to control medical literature and particularly control the quality, then we should ban about half the journals or 80% of the journals that have very porous peer review and are basically just looking for content. If you believe, as I do, that this stuff is going to get out there anyway. And so we might as well have a venue where people can post it in gender communication, be able to cite it and know that it's going to retain there. It can have versions in it and be linked if there are ultimate peer review publications. And then that can also foster collaborations earlier in the process. I can know what my colleagues are doing and working on, and we can begin to build on each other's work in ways that are more expeditious than might have occurred otherwise. So I thank you for your attention. I know we're sort of at the end, but maybe we have time for just a couple more questions. Thanks so much.
Thank you. We have a couple of questions. So Ed has a question, and then Sarah Hull has a question.
Harlan, thanks so much. I debated whether I should ask this question. It's a little bit provocative, but I just wanted to throw that out there in the context of an open discussion. As I listen to the arguments for preprint, and obviously this is a very important discussion, there's obviously a big balance here between information and commentary that is useful. And I when I was listening to the discussion about the Mandrola article, I was thinking to myself, it's almost very similar to some of the Facebook arguments. And I'm wondering how do you strike the balance at MedArchive about the type of commentary and the sort of the vitriol that some of the higher profile documents engender?
So we do screen papers. We ask ourselves the question, if this is wrong, will it cause harm? If somebody came out and said nobody should be getting, and we don't have opinion pieces, we follow the publication guidelines, ICGME, disclosure, IRB, these are scientific manuscripts, so that there's a methods. If someone submits something where the methods couldn't be reproduced, you can't tell what they did, it would be screened out. So this is Mandrola. They've gone to the VAERS database. They've described what they've done and done an analysis, and then they have a discussion. If somebody would come up, we screened out a lot of the hydroxychloroquine pieces because they were obviously sort of political and opinion pieces. They weren't science. But should we have screened out everything that should we only have posted as a preprint something that conformed with our own beliefs? Or should we be able to say that, science needs to enable people who found different things to post and have those be discussed, and then again, perhaps accelerate the kind of next study that needs to be done. I think what the public has discovered in the course of all this is that, science isn't always yes and no. There are degrees of gray in all the scientific information, just as medicine has degrees of gray. And so, the notion of the preprint server is very different than Facebook, where people would be doing advertisements or promoting certain points of view. These are scientific articles. And again, that we put these guardrails in place to try to ensure that they are scientific articles. But if people want to distort, change, or overstate what's in a preprint, the preprint's there for people to go back to and look. I think if you and the caveats around what a preprint is. But I like I said, I think cat's out of the bag about this stuff. I mean, if Mandrola doesn't post it here, he's putting it in his blog. And similarly, what do you control what Marjorie Greene's going to say? I mean, to take this as an example of like why we shouldn't have preprints. I mean, she grabs anything. And so anyway, that's my view of it, is that I want to be able to enhance the communication but do it in a way that mitigates the risks. And so far, I mean, I haven't seen large scale risks accrue as a result of the preprints.
So I think I'll have one question from Sarah Hall, and then Eric has a question that I'm going to pose right away. It's, have there been any experiences in MyArchive or MedArchive regarding preprints impacting the process of establishing patents? So I'm going to leave those two questions. Sarah, please feel free to unmute yourself.
Thank you so much. So I would echo some of the earlier points made, and I think Harlan's point is well taken, that science is really nuanced, and that we should be posting. I agree in theory with the idea of the democratization of information, such that there can be nuanced, intelligent, thoughtful debate. But unfortunately, what we've seen, and as Rachel pointed out, scientific literacy among the lay public is shockingly poor, even amongst somewhat educated people, and unfortunately amongst a lot of our elected representatives. And so, I wonder, is there also some responsibility perhaps to maybe establish a more formal partnership with experts in communication? For example, establishing some sort of collaboration with science reporters from the Times or other reputable publications, so that rather than sort of reacting to these controversial claims that are made by the MTGs of the world, actually sort of getting ahead of things and saying, oh, okay, here's this, before this Twitter war erupts, here's this new preprint, here are some of the implications. That's not to say that it's going to prevent any kind of egregious claims, but I think, unfortunately, what happens so often and what we've seen is that something comes out, conspiracy theorists or people with just a really suboptimal scientific literacy take it, run with it, make a really unsubstantiated or exaggerated claim, and then we're reacting to kind of clean up the mess. And is there a way that we can sort of establish a prophylaxis against that kind of behavior? And I think that partnering with experts in communications, because experts in data science may not be expert in communication and often aren't, unfortunately. And is there some way that we can sort of bridge that gap of scientific literacy and nuance where we can sort of get ahead of things? Because I think that there's also a responsibility to educate the public that may not be the responsibility of scientists alone. I think that's really an indictment of our educational system at many different levels, but can we at least try to sort of make some inroads in improving overall understanding of how science works amongst the lay public?
Yeah, I mean, I would just say from the beginning, we were working with reporters, and in my experience, most of the reporters have been very responsible in the way in which they've communicated preprint information. These are exceptions outside of, I think, the usual, where, I mean, I don't know why the Telegraph did that, but if you look at the Times, the way that they usually report preprint information, it almost always says this is pre-peer review or preliminary. And I mean, again, what's the alternative? The alternative is Mandrola puts this on his blog. There's no enduring artifact of what the preprint is. There's no place to go look at it, and there's no linkage to the commentary. I mean, in this case, you can follow the debate. You can see what it's about. It's a question of the world in the context in which we live. Like I said, even the Sprint trial, I mean, press release for 2 months, was all that clinicians and patients had from the Sprint trial. And, I think this is an attempt to try to enable people to put up what their work is and to elicit comment on it. And these norms are going to be evolving over time. But I don't think we can go back. And if it's not here, it's going to be somewhere. So, I think that it's a matter of us trying to optimize and like I said, put the guardrails around it. With regard to the patent side, the preprint establishes the provenance of ideas. And so that's one of the arguments for it, is if you've got an idea that you think is meritorious and that you want to be able to establish your mark on it and timestamp when it went live in public, that's what a preprint can do. And, that doesn't need to be peer reviewed. That's just about you claiming, something that is scientific. But again, these are scientific papers. They're not, you can't post anything. You can't post opinion pieces. You can't post a patent application. It has to be scientific paper. But it does establish the provenance of ideas and in a more timely way.
Thanks, Harlan. That would be all for today. I think we've gone a little over, but next week we'll have the highlights of the ESC Congress, and then we have an external speaker the following week. If you have obviously any suggestions on external speakers, please let us know. And thanks again, Harlan, for.
And I just want to say thank you for everyone. I mean, I take all the comments very constructively and importantly, listening carefully and trying to think what we can do to improve MedArchive as a result of the kind of things you're saying. So I just want to express appreciation for everyone.